Well, my name is JohnDehnert, and I have been doing small groups for seriously about 30 years now. I started getting paid for small groups back in 1980.
Wow.
And I'm the small group pastor at Shadow Mountain Church, and I lead our small group ministry team. And we are all about creating life-changing small groups all over San Diego County. Well, churches should invest in developing a robust small group ministry for a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is really, really practical. A lot of churches, especially in Southern California, are very strapped for space. It literally solves one of the major problems, just organizationally, practically, for any church. If a church doesn't have enough classroom space, then this is a solution. You have as much classroom space as you need in terms of small group leaders' homes. Mm. So that solves a huge problem. That may be the number one reason that at Shadow Mountain we began to look at small groups seriously about 10 or 12 years ago. But spiritually speaking, there really isn't, in terms of a ministry delivery system, there really isn't a better way to help grow and mature and develop your people spiritually. There's an old saying, I don't know where it started, but I believe it, that life change happens best in small groups, and we say that over and over and over again. And I think the reason why is really clear, and it's actually pretty simple. Number one, we're able to concentrate our focus on biblical truth. We're able to help people pay attention to God's Word, but then empower that look with relationships. Mm-hmm. So it's the ability to intake spiritual, biblical truth, but then to apply it to our lives because of our relationships. So those are a couple of the reasons why it's really, really critical. Oh, and one other thing that I probably should mention is that it may be also the best way to take ministry out of the four walls of the church and into the community. So if there's a church that wants to be reaching out into their community, we're already there because that's where our small groups are at. Well, okay, let me answer that a couple of ways. One way, let me just answer it organizationally. If anybody ever asks me, what does it take to build a small group ministry, it really boils down to two things. I try to do the simple method. I try to focus on the irreducible minimum in any scenario. So, if a church wants to grow a small group ministry, just organizationally, it requires two things. Number one, leaders. You have to have leaders. You have to develop leaders. And what that means, really what we're talking about is creating openings or spaces for people to go to small groups. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to move people into those openings. So two things, leadership development and then move the weekend population. That's kind of it in a nutshell organizationally. But when it comes to small group leaders, their health determines the health of the small group ministry. And so where we're at right now, let me answer it this way. Where we're at right now with small groups at Shadow Mountain is we're trying to help and care for the leaders, first through training, and then second through experiences, and then third we're installing a coaching structure. And so let me start at the beginning. And this might answer some other questions down the road, but the training component, we take that very seriously. We know that there are leaders who are willing to lead and serve and create these groups, but they need help. Many of them haven't ever done that in the past, and so we do some foundational training. We call it Foundations in Leadership. 6 sessions long, and we ask all of our leaders to go through that. In some other scenarios, we'll do turbo groups where our pastoral staff, either me or Dale Bacon or Manuel Sanchez, we will lead intensive small groups that focus on 2 things: community and leadership development. So we take leadership seriously. It's not just an orientation. But then there are all ongoing leadership experiences. We call them leadership communities. And so quarterly, we get together with all of our leaders. We invite everybody, the hosts, the leaders, the apprentice leaders, and we do ongoing support and care. It's usually a Saturday morning, might be 3 hours long. We give them breakfast. We check in with them on how their groups are going. We give them time to discuss their groups. And then we also give them an additional leadership component, whether it's dealing with conflict and confrontation or how do you develop an apprentice, anything along those lines. And we're just all in with those kinds of things. And there was a third thing. I'm trying to remember what it was. The coaching. We are now identifying leaders of leaders. And Dale and I, and again, Manny and Carolyn Rossi, we are developing our groups of coaches so that we can spread out our span of care. There's a limit to how much we pastors, how many we can touch individually. But if we can spread that out through coaches and do that life on life, then it increases the care that we can provide for leaders significantly. So we're doing that a lot, based on Exodus 18, by the way, Moses and Jethro. Well, some of the challenges that we have in small group ministry, and I think many churches have these same challenges. I'll mention a few things. Maybe the greatest challenge that we have here, and I think many churches have this, is what I'll just call competing systems. And another way to say it might be a lack of alignment around small groups as like the ministry delivery system for our church. And so what that does is it dilutes our potency and our effectiveness as a ministry. It gives people a number of different options that they can select, and as a result, it can greatly diminish the effectiveness of any given ministry. So it's not just small group ministry. It's whatever the church decides is going to be their primary delivery system. So competing systems is a challenge. We experience attrition with our leaders. In other words, they just stop leading. That's the bottom line. And probably the number one reason why we have leaders stop leading is because they're tired, they're busy, they're overcommitted, and they're doing so many different things in the church that they have to say no to something. And they frankly say no to small groups. And again, I don't have necessarily any heartburn with that. It just has to do with what are we trying to be as a church. And if we're trying to be a church of small groups, then having the competing systems, it makes people choose. They have to decide because they can't do everything. They've got to decide what they're going to do. So that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for any ministry. Another thing that I'll mention has to do with something I mentioned earlier regarding coaching. Many churches depend too heavily on their senior leaders when it comes to small groups. There's a practice called span of care in small groups and in leadership in general, when a small group ministry violates span of care, it's very detrimental to the small group ministry itself. And the way the span of care works is, the way I can describe it is, everyone should be cared for, but no one should care for more than they can handle. And again, it goes back to Exodus 18, and Jethro said, Moses, what are you doing? You can't lead everybody. You can't be the decider. You can't be the guy in charge with every scenario, every decision. You have to have leaders of 10s and 50s and hundreds and thousands. So I have a limited span of care. I think that I can, I always say that I have 12 or 15 really good touches in me. And beyond that, those touches diminish in effectiveness. But we have hundreds of leaders. So if I'm limited to, say, 10 to 15, how can I maximize that? Well, again, it has to do with coaches. So one of the big challenges then is, how do you develop that coaching structure? How do you get leaders to buy into that coaching structure and embrace their coach as a leader? So those are two really big challenges for small groups.
Okay.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I would suggest to anybody who's new to leading small groups, maybe at the pastoral level, but even if they're in a volunteer role, but they're overseeing a large portion of, or all of, the small group ministry. And my number one recommendation would be in a life-changing community yourself. In other words, be in a small group. It's easy to, because of the demands and the needs of the ministry and the nature of small group ministry, it's easy to do the work of the ministry and then one day look up and realize you're on an island all by yourself. And the bottom line, I think, with ministry in general, but specifically with small group ministry, is that you have to have inflow. There's a ton of outflow. There are all kinds of problems that you're going to have to deal with, all kinds of leadership challenges, many different scenarios that come up that require something from you. That's outflow. So what are you doing to create inflow in your life? Again, if life change happens best in small groups, then that's true for you as well. And so that's my number one recommendation. If it means you lead the group, then lead the group. But leading the group also means you're in the group and you're a full participant in that group. But preferably it would be a group that maybe you don't even lead, that you're just an active member. And here's the added benefit. What it does for you as a senior leader in the small group ministry is it adds a lot of credibility with your leaders. So you're not just the distant leader who doesn't know what it's like in the trenches. No, you're right in it, and whatever you're asking for from them is what you're delivering. So it's not just good for you personally, but that's the most important reason. It's also good for you organizationally, and it elevates your influence with your small group leaders and your coaches.
Thank you so much.
Okay.